Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Politics from the Penn Political Review at the University of Pennsylvania, a podcast where we bring experts on various topics from campus to talk about current events. We're here with Professor Ian Lustick, who teaches Middle Eastern politics, comparative politics, and computer modeling. His present research focuses on the implications of the disappearance of the option of a negotiated two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. His new book is called Paradigm Lost: From Two-State Solution to One-State Reality. Did I miss anything?
Nope.
Fantastic. So my name is David Lerner, and let's begin. So to start, I was wondering if you could take us back to what Israel and Palestine looked like before the creation of the Israeli state in 1948.
Well, right before 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel, that country was known as Palestine, from the Jordan River to the sea, and it was ruled under a British colonial regime known as a League of Nations mandate. Mm-hmm. So between the end of World War I, essentially 1919 to 1920, between then and 1948, the British ruled Palestine. And the Zionist movement had a relationship with Britain, signaled by the Balfour Declaration, that gave Zionists the right to bring in Jews and build what the British called a Jewish national home, and what the Zionists believed and wanted it to become a Jewish state in as much of Palestine as possible. The Arabs opposed this. So what you had in the 28 years before the creation of the State of Israel was a three-way struggle between the Palestinian Arabs, who wanted to stop Zionism and achieve independence for themselves in this British colony, the Jews, the Zionists, who wanted for the most part to transform the country into a Jewish state and subordinate, or in some cases transfer, the Arabs out of the country, and the British, who were conflicted about what they wanted, as most colonial powers are, but for a lot of the time just wanted things to be quiet. And as World War II approached, that was their main concern, is to get things to be quiet so it wouldn't bother them during the war.
And so what was the inspiration for the creation of an Israeli state, and what eventually led to it becoming a reality?
The inspiration of it, the impetus for it, I should say, is that throughout Europe after industrialization, nationalism took root, and these national movements produced national states that replaced large monarchical or imperial states, the Holy Roman Empire even, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Tsarist regime. These national states emphasized ethnicity and common language, common religion, common culture. And Jews who lived in all the European countries, but especially in the Eastern European countries, but in all of them, were increasingly out of place in many of these countries. Many of the countries did not look kindly upon non-ethnics. Were Jews really Frenchmen? Were they really Hungarians? Were they really Poles? In that context, the Jews, who had survived a generally anti-Semitic Gentile culture for centuries, found it more difficult. First of all, they were assimilating to becoming less traditionally Jewish in terms of religion and more westernized, as we would call it, after the Enlightenment. They were frustrated to find that even if they wanted to give up a lot of what it meant to be Jewish, they still weren't fully accepted. In the 19th century, the mid-19th century, so well after this started, this whole process, the Russian Empire entered a crisis, and that crisis produced a tremendous crisis for Jews living in Eastern Europe. We had millions and millions of Jews crowded into an area, including some of the Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, the western areas of Belarus, Russia. These were the only areas Jews were allowed to live, and there were great restrictions on them. An extremely anti-Semitic movement arose in Tsarist Russia that created unlivable conditions for the Jews. Most people responded by either hunkering down and waiting for better days or leaving for America. Others embraced socialism and revolution. Others found nationalism. But how were you going to have nationalism when you didn't have a country? One way to do it was to declare that Jews were a Yiddish-speaking socialist nation, And they didn't need a state of their own. They just needed autonomy in all the different countries, whether it was Austria or Hungary or Poland or Lithuania or Russia. A small minority, however, thought that really the only solution was to leave Europe altogether and find a place where Jews could have a country of their own. But where, since all the areas in the world were occupied? These people who thought of themselves as Zionists, called themselves Zionists in the late 19th century, didn't, for the most part, believe that it had to be Palestine. It had to be the land of Israel, where the Bible says the Jews started. And they explored many areas, Argentina, Uganda, a variety of places. But ultimately, if a Jew was going to leave Eastern Europe for an unknown land, it was more likely to leave it for Britain or the United States, where there's supposed to be gold in the streets, than to go live somewhere in Uganda or Argentina or Australia or Mozambique that they'd never heard of. Mm-hmm. In that context, the idea of going back to the land of Israel was very appealing to a minority, a tiny minority of Jews, and they're the ones who started going to Palestine, committed to the idea of a Jewish country with a Jewish majority, not knowing too much about who lived there, and eventually finding out that there were Arabs, but realizing that, well, that was not a problem that Zionism could solve right away. They were just going to have to put it on the back burner, and meanwhile, bring as many Jews as possible to the country. To give you a sense of just how small the Zionist movement was, if we had between 1885 and 1914 1.5 million Jews who left Eastern Europe to go to the United States or Britain, 1.5 million, only about 50,000 went to Palestine. Of those, half left. So it's a tiny, tiny minority of Jews, and those Jews were condemned by the majority of rabbis as breaking Jewish law for trying to go to the land of Israel before God brought the Jews to the land of Israel, which is how the return was supposed to happen. So you have a movement that was a minority, but because of what happened in World War II and what happened in the 1930s and an effective alliance between the Jews in Palestine and Britain, there was significant pressure for Jews to leave Europe, and one of the only places they could go was Palestine.
So, what was the original plan for how to divide up the land, and what did that implementation work like in practice, like in reality?
You mean the original Zionist plan?
No, the original plan in 1948.
Oh, well, in 1948, we have to go back to 1937, which is the Zionists were, generally speaking, not interested in saying very clearly early on what they wanted, because what they really wanted, they knew the Arabs would never accept. And in fact, the world was unlikely to accept, because they wanted the whole country to be Jewish. And they didn't really know what to do with the Arabs there. There were, maybe 10 times the number of Arabs in the country as there were Jews. So what they used formulas that were deceiving. For example, we'll have parity with the Arabs, even though our populations aren't the same. We'll have political parity until we're a majority, and then we'll have democracy. There were a lot of contradictory positions that leaders of the Zionist movement took. Eventually, the British found that they couldn't get the Jews and the Arabs to agree on anything. So they said, we're going to have to divide the country, partition. We'll make one state where there will be almost all Jews. We'll transfer Arabs out of it into a somewhat larger state in Palestine that'll be Arab. The Jews were very divided about this. Some who were pragmatic thought, let's start at least with a small state like this, because if we have a state in 1937 and Hitler is threatening the Jews of Europe, at least we'll be able to bring in Jews to this small state and expand later. The Arabs were horrified by the idea of chunks of the country which were heavily inhabited by Arabs being given to the Jews and all those Arabs being expelled from them. So they completely rejected the plan. The British withdrew the plan eventually as unworkable, and then World War II started. But that idea of partition stuck. And after World War II, Britain got so frustrated with the conflict that they went to the UN and say, you take this problem, we're leaving. They, the UN recommended partition. By a narrow margin, they voted to divide the country into two states. The Jewish state would be larger than it was under the British plan, but smaller than the state of Israel that emerged after the 1948 war. And they would be economically linked, and Jerusalem would be an international city, what they called a corpus separatum. That was the UN plan for partition. The plan for partition was not implemented. The Arabs rejected it. The Jews accepted it in principle, but did not accept the borders. And when some fighting started, Jewish units moved into areas that were supposed to be Arab areas. Arabs tried to move into areas that were Jewish areas. And in general, it was a chaos when the British left in May of 1948. Civil war had already started through the whole country. And after May 1948, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Syrians, small pieces of their armies moved toward Palestine. In the course of that fighting, Israeli forces, who were very well organized and relatively well armed because they'd been preparing for decades under the British mandate, were able to not only defend virtually all the areas that had been allotted to them by the UN partition plan, but expanded those borders and expelled or encouraged to flee about 750,000 Palestinian Arabs, so that in the area that became Israel, at that time only about 12% of the population was Arab, even though if all the Arabs had stayed where they were, there would have been an even number of Jews and Arabs in the country that became Israel.
Interesting. So I want to fast forward now to the modern-day structure of the conflict. So just in terms of determining the negotiating sides, it seems more clear that one of the sides is the Israeli government, but it seems the reality on the Palestinian side is a little more muddled. Could you talk about the evolution of the Palestinian negotiating side?
I could, but we can first start with the Israeli side because, yes, it's true that the Israeli government is the side that negotiates in general, but number one, that government has changed so many times. And although in recent years the line that the government has taken is more or less consistent, which is against any kind of real Palestinian state, in the past there have been Israeli governments that have been much more open to negotiating some kind of an arrangement that the Palestinians might have been able to live with, some kind of political division of the country. It's not entirely clear, but let's be clear that there were different Israeli governments. Also, when the Israeli government failed to reach an agreement with the Palestinian Authority, and we'll get to what that is in a minute, there were elements among the Palestinians and among the Israelis who were not representatives of the government who started to negotiate with one another. One of the most important agreements reached was called the Geneva Agreement, negotiated by prominent Israelis and prominent Palestinians, and it had a very, very detailed outline of what an agreement between the two countries, the two peoples would be. It doesn't have any official status, but it's interesting that there have been negotiations of that sort. That's not the only one. Now let's go to the Palestinian side, and you're right, it's more complicated, which it always is when you're dealing with not a recognized state, but a movement. When the British or the Arabs tried to negotiate with the Zionist movement before it was a state, they didn't know whether they should talk to the World Zionist Organization in Europe, the heads of the Jewish community in Palestine, the labor Zionist movement, or the revisionist Zionist movement, or the liberal capitalist version of it, which is Chaim Weizmann. They didn't know who really the leadership was, and they squabbled a lot among themselves. So that's really normal in a national liberation movement, if that's what how you want to see Zionism. The Palestinians had the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was effectively like the Zionist organization. It arose in the diaspora, tried to make a presence inside Palestine itself, and was dedicated to the return of a people that saw itself as having been exiled from its land. Very interestingly similar. But it was divided because it didn't have the ability a state does to enforce laws on itself. So just like Zionism, so too the PLO had to allow a lot of decentralization, which slowed the the process by which the PLO was ready to negotiate with Israel, and there were compromise on deep questions of giving up parts of the country. In the end, Fatah, the main central bourgeois nationalist core of the PLO, dominated. That was Yasser Arafat's organization. And that's the group that negotiated with the Rabin government of Israel in the early 90s, the Oslo Agreements. The Oslo Agreements was fundamentally an agreement in stages to divide the land in some way that would be discovered through about 5 or 6 years of negotiations, so that the West Bank and Gaza would be the core of a real Palestinian state. It didn't say state in the plan, but everybody knew that that's what was supposed to happen. And there was an informal agreement in 1995 between one of the main Israeli politicians, Yossi Beylin, and the current president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, it was called the Beylin Abu Mazen plan. And that plan did say 2 states for 2 peoples, with Jerusalem as a capital for each. The Oslo Accords were never implemented in full. They were beginning to be implemented, but for a variety of reasons, which we may not have time to discuss in this podcast, the process broke down. Broke down in part because Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister, who was reluctant to acknowledge the need for a Palestinian state, but who finally probably did, was assassinated by a right-wing extremist, an Israeli extremist, because settlement processes continued and made it difficult for the Palestinian leadership to convince most Palestinians that actually this process was leading to something that they would like rather than a continued kind of occupation. And mistakes that were made by all players, but especially Ehud Barak and Bill Clinton, I think, for interrupting the process of implementation that was in train and trying to go for broke without being willing to compromise at the Camp David summit in 1999. So now it's even more complicated because the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were in the 1990s under the rule of the Palestinian Authority, which is effectively a version of the PLO. But during the struggle against the Israeli occupation, the Muslim movement, which was strong throughout the Middle East, came to express itself through a rival to the PLO known as Hamas. Hamas is an outgrowth of the Muslim Brothers. That's the organization that elected the president in Egypt, who was then overthrown in a coup, and they were very strong in the West Bank and in Gaza, especially in Gaza. Since there was a lot of corruption among the Fatah officials who were ruling Gaza after the breakdown of the Oslo Accords in 2000, 2001, when they held elections in Gaza, Hamas won. And the United States and Israel did not like that at all. Tried to overthrow Hamas by giving arms and encouragement to Fatah. But the people of Gaza were so strongly against the corruption in Fatah that Hamas was able to crush that coup attempt by Israel, Fatah, and Israel, the PLO, and the United States. And what we have, therefore, is a kind of separate country almost. It's not a country, it's an enclave. Israel calls it an enclave, run mostly by Hamas, but with other groups also. And even though there have been attempts by Gazans and West Bankers to unite so that they could form a negotiating front for Israel, the current right-wing governments in Israel have not really wanted the Palestinians to have a credible negotiating front, because that would then put Israel in the position of having to decide whether it wanted to make any serious compromises. So when those efforts to unite the West Bank and Gaza were close to fruition, mainly through the efforts of very popular and politically potent prisoners inside Israeli prisons who represent both Gazans and West Bankers, Israel stood in the way of that. Would not allow those prisoners to operate in that way, and specifically one prisoner, Marwan Barghouti, probably the single most popular Palestinian still today. And as a result, Partly as a result, Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank are separate. And so when Israel can say, if we negotiate with the PLO or in the West Bank, that doesn't give us an agreement in Gaza and vice versa. So really it is very complicated. And there haven't been serious negotiations since, in my view, there haven't been any serious negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians since 1997.
So that's a great transition. I want to talk now more about efforts toward peace. So obviously, one of the most common solutions you hear for the conflict, as you mentioned, is the two-state solution, which means the creation of both a Palestinian and Israeli state. Could you explain when that became the general effort people coalesced around?
It became a kind of majority opinion among Israeli Jews in the early 90s, after it was endorsed, after the principle of partition and territorial withdrawal was endorsed by the Rabin Peres government in 91. Before that, it was a minority view, but many Israelis were always in favor of getting out of heavily populated Arab areas of the West Bank and Gaza, not knowing exactly what would become of those areas, but not wanting to include them. Palestinians, after the 67 war, some of them started to see that they were never probably going to get Arab rule of all of Palestine back. Maybe the thing to do was to try to get Arab rule of the West Bank and Gaza. It took the PLO until much later, probably late in the first Intifada, late in the 1980s, early 90s, before it started to realize seriously that the most it was going to get was a state in part of Palestine, and that's what it should negotiate for. It was difficult because most of the PLO leadership were not from the West Bank and Gaza. They were from parts of Israel proper, Jaffa or Haifa or Tiberias, places like that. But that's where the movement went. So by the 90s, you had majorities on both sides that wanted a two-state solution. That's already 25 years ago. Since then, the book I've written is about the disappearance of that as a possible negotiated outcome. And that's not, even though it has disappeared, and even though insiders know that, since there is no other obvious pretty picture that people can agree on to take its place, there's a certain amount of confusion, despair, meandering, wandering, and grinding of wheels. The endless discussions about whether there will be new negotiations are over water, and whether this plan by Mitchell or that plan by John Kerry or this plan by Trump, all of it is pretty much meaningless because the issue has gone so far beyond what it was that I don't really think the issue is peace between Palestinians and Israelis or Palestinians and Jews. It's more equality of Palestinians and Jews living in the same country, but by very, very different rules. Just like you wouldn't say that after the Civil War, the problem was not peace between blacks and whites inside the United States. It's really the question for 100 years, if not more, is equality of blacks and whites. Could that be achieved? Or how could inequality be preserved? And another implication of switching to thinking of the struggle as one over equality and not one of a struggle between Jews and Arabs is that the two sides are not two sides. Each one is divided so deeply within itself that many Palestinians have more in common with many Jews than those Jews have in common with other Jews, or that those Palestinians have in common with other Palestinians. And that's just as we see in the United States, the kind of changes that occurred where the Democratic Party, for example, was the party that imposed and enforced Jim Crow in the South for generations. But now the Democratic Party can't win elections in the United States without massive black voter turnout. And that's the kind of change that I think Israeli Jews, Palestinian Arabs, those are the kind of changes that country's going to have to undergo. They're very, very difficult, very long-term changes, but I don't see, we didn't get in the United States progress toward equality because black leaders and white leaders got together and agreed on some kind of, no, it's a very complicated process of democratic integration and struggle over many different issues where different groups start to have alliances with other groups that they never imagined would be their allies.
So I wanted to, you mentioned a few key figures there. So I wanted to ask, what role has the United States traditionally played in facilitating negotiations?
The United States, from early on, back in the 50s, tried to get Israel and the Arabs to agree to some things that would calm the conflict down, because at that time the United States was mainly interested in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and they thought the Israelis and the Arabs were silly because the real enemy was the Soviet Union and communism. Why were they fighting among themselves? But really, the United States overemphasized the degree to which anybody in the Middle East cared that much about the Soviet Union or whether that was the real threat. For Jews and Arabs, the Jews were the threat to the Arabs and the Arabs were the threat to the Jews. That was real. So American efforts to solve the refugee problem or achieve a solution to the water issue with Jordan, Israel, and Syria and Lebanon, or to negotiate some kind of secret deal between Nasser and Ben Gurion, they didn't come to very much. And then, after the '67 war, American government found itself attracted to the idea of trying to get a settlement, a fair settlement, because it had so many interests in the Arab world, not just oil, but security interests and votes at the UN, but also and interest in the Muslim world, but also that Jews in the United States were politically very powerful, and other groups in the United States were very supportive of Israel. So presidents got caught, starting even with President Johnson. On the one hand, there was an interest in making sure that the United States was totally supporting Israel, or perceived to be totally supporting Israeli security, because otherwise the president would be exposed to bitter criticism at home. On the other hand, if you went too far in that direction, you sacrificed strategic, geostrategic, and economic interests in the Arab and Muslim world and throughout the whole great game with the Soviet Union. That meant that negotiating initiatives that were put forward in the Johnson administration, but especially in the Nixon administration under Kissinger and then Ford, Carter, were compromised over and over again. They had, in order to succeed, there had to be presidential pressure on Israel. And there was sometimes some presidential pressure on Israel, but never enough to move the Israeli political system toward the kind of difficult decisions that would have been necessary to achieve a compromised peace. And so in that context, the right-wing forces in Israel gained power because it became apparent that the United States really wasn't going to stop Israel from settling the West Bank so heavily that Israel would never leave it. And that's what happened. And so as time has gone on through the George W. Bush and then the Obama administrations, the attempts to orchestrate an agreement, whether that was through Mitchell during Obama or Kerry during Obama or something called the roadmap under George W. Bush, they never went anywhere. They always got derailed. And I describe this not as a peace process, which is how it's usually described, because a process is movement that takes you from one state of affairs to a different state of affairs. That's what a process is, whether it's an assembly line or anything else. But what we have here in the diplomatic activity of the United States over and over again is more of a merry-go-round, where you have lots of movement, but it keeps going around and around and around, from some kind of initiative to try something new to hope, and then failure, and then apology to Israel for trying to pressure it, and then you start again.
So time to transition into the final questions.
Yes.
So first, what currently remain the biggest obstacles to resolving this issue on both the Palestinian and Israeli sides?
Well, when you say, first of all, resolving an issue imagines that there's a solution. And in politics, it's probably not a good idea to think about solutions in the sense of a final solution where there won't be any problem afterward. I think about what kind of processes are possible so that the problems that exist in the future will not be as bad as the ones that exist now. Right now, I don't see a solution in this particular sense, that I don't see a really pretty picture of the future that I know how to get to, or that I think anyone knows how to get to. If I could generate a lot of pictures of the future that are nicer than the present, but then I wouldn't call those solutions unless I have a plausible way to get there in a way that's acceptable, that negotiations could lead there, political change could lead there. What I do see, therefore, is so then you could reformulate the question, what's the biggest obstacle to activities that could lead to better problems? And I think, ironically, because I'm someone who fought for a two-state solution from as early on as the early 1970s and continued to do so right up through the early aughts, by which time I started to think, this is counterproductive. And now I do think that, oddly enough, the situation has changed so much that the belief that it might be possible to negotiate a two-state solution is the biggest obstacle to actually making progress toward better problems. Because as long as you think that you could get a two-state solution, then you postpone thinking about the things that are really important, which is how to achieve equality and democracy for all the people who live between the river and the sea. And I'll give one very, very specific example. In Israel, doves, those who wanted to leave the West Bank and Gaza and trade them for some kind of peace agreement with the Arab world, and the Arab world has offered peace on that basis. That's the Arab Peace Initiative, a 2 decades old proposal from the Arab countries, which Israel has never responded to officially. But that initiative asks for essentially complete Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza. In order for those who support that kind of thing in Israel have always argued to Israelis who didn't want to do that, look, you Israeli Jews who you don't like Arabs, do you? You would rather have a country with mostly Jews and not half Arabs. It may make you nervous. They make you uncomfortable. They're not like you. This is a Jewish country, isn't it? So why don't you oppose settlements like we do in the West Bank and Gaza? Why don't you vote for the dovish parties? That's called the demographic argument. And doves in Israel have used that for decades. Probably some people, they've used it effectively, but it hasn't won the day. Now, even I have made that argument to an extent. Because if you want a Jewish state with a small Arab minority, you can't have it if you keep the West Bank and Gaza. On the other hand, so that was, for the point of view of progressives in Israel, a positive thing. Make the demographic argument. Give the Arabs their country over there, and we'll have ours here, the Jews. But if it's not really possible for Israel to leave the West Bank and Gaza, and you keep making that demographic argument because you pretend it is possible, what you're really doing is you're telling Jews, Arabs can't be trusted. You're going to have to live with them, but you don't want to, do you? They are making you uncomfortable, aren't they? In other words, you're telling them, number one, don't look to Arabs as political allies, which is what the current situation absolutely requires. And two, if you can't be comfortable with Arabs in your country, and they have to stay in your country because you can't leave the West Bank and Gaza, there are only 2 things you can do. One is expel them, and another is enslave them. So when I say that the lingering mirage of a 2-state solution is the biggest obstacle to activity that could lead to progress toward better problems, that's a specific example of how the false image that we might still get a negotiated two-state solution encourages people to make arguments and to build and that prevent necessary political alliances and that create the sentiments that apartheid requires.
So that's a good transition into the last question, which regards your new book. So your book is about how you've transitioned now to from arguing to a two-state solution to how a one-state solution is now the reality. Could you explain how you came to that conclusion and what that might look like?
Yes, but I have to slightly correct what you said, because I don't say that the one-state solution is the reality, though I agree it's a confusing position. I say that what we have is a one-state reality. Since it's not a pretty picture of a democratic state, it's an ugly reality of a very limited democracy where different castes of people live under very different rules, very different amounts of coercion, very different degrees to which their property is protected or their lives are safe, whether you live depending on whether you are an Arab in Gaza or a Jew in Jerusalem or an Arab in East Jerusalem or an Arab in Tulkarm or an Arab in the Galilee or a Jew in a West Bank settlement. Different laws, different rules, different expectations apply. That's a very ugly picture of pervasive, complicated discrimination and oppression. And so I don't see this as a one-state solution. There's no one-state solution that's a reality. It's a one-state reality. Now let's look at the dynamics of that reality. And it might be that after 150 years, we could end up with something that you and I might now consider a one-state solution. However, it also is possible, as happened in Britain, when Britain annexed Ireland in 1800, after occupying it for hundreds of years. It took 120 years, but the Irish Catholics, who were denied equal political rights for generations, not only got equal rights, but built a political movement so strong that they disrupted British politics at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, and after World War I, which was also a big event, produced a two-state solution. So politics doesn't stop. What I'm saying is we're not in a solution. We're in a reality. It's time to right now stop talking about solutions, start talking about the dynamics of the reality and how those dynamics could be pushed toward better problems.
Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.